Hello and welcome to Project Noon. Our guest today is Professor SherAli Tareen. Professor Tareen is Associate Professor and Department Chair of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College. His research focuses on Muslim intellectual traditions and debates in early modern and modern South Asia. He is the author of the much celebrated Defending Muhammad in Modernity, published in 2020, as well as a more recent 2023 publication, which will be the topic of our present discussion today, Perilous Intimacies, Debating Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire. Now, Professor Tareen had joined us for a lecture as part of an online program we had conducted in collaboration with the Cambridge Interfaith program in August last year. But in today's conversation, it will hopefully offer us a chance to dive deeper into some of the wide-ranging themes of the book. To give you a brief overview of the book, Professor Tareen explores how leading South Asian Muslim thinkers imagined and contested the boundaries of Hindu-Muslim friendship from the late 18th to mid-20th centuries. He argues that often what was at stake in Muslim scholarly discourse and debates on Hindu-Muslim friendship were unresolved tensions and fissures over the place and meaning of Islam in the modern world. So Perilous Intimacies considers a range of topics, including Muslim scholarly translations of Hinduism, Hindu-Muslim theological polemics, the question of interreligious friendship in the Qur'an, intra-Muslim debates on cow sacrifice, and debates on emulating Hindu customs and habits. Based on close reading of an expansive and multifaceted archive of Arabic, Persian, and Urdu sources, this book illuminates the depth, complexity, and profound divisions of the Muslim intellectual traditions of South Asia. So firstly, Professor Tareen, thank you for joining us again and for your generous time. To begin with, can you briefly sketch the key arguments from your book, perhaps by way of explaining the very interesting title choice, Perilous Intimacies?
Well, thank you, first of all, Saad, for inviting me to your podcast. The audience in India for me has always been the most important audience. So I really welcome this opportunity, and thank you for this opportunity to share fragments of my book with you today. So primarily, as you mentioned in your introduction, the main theme of this book is how does intra-Muslim contestations on the limits and boundaries of inter-religious friendship becomes the site for the articulation of different notions of Islam and its limits in the conditions of early modern and modern South Asia, which are marked by the gradual but decisive loss of Muslim political sovereignty in South Asia. So in relation to the title, what I'm basically indexing with that title is ways in which friendship, especially interreligious friendship, can pose both a promise as well as a peril. Promise in the sense of providing certain forms of benefits and opportunities or expansion of the self or of the community in terms of political collaboration and other forms of, promise of power and pleasure that one might yield from relationships of friendship with the religious other. But at the same time, being blindingly bound to a harmful friend can also lead to the evisceration of the self and by extension that of the community. So, interestingly, even in Western philosophical thought, this idea of friendship has been presented and has been talked about as a concept which has what one scholar calls the double face of friendship. Alexander Nehemas, who's written this very magisterial and interesting book on the philosophical discourses on friendship in the Western canon, whereby this whole idea that friendship can pose both a promise as well as a peril. The other sort of thinker or meditation on friendship that really informed my conceptual apparatus was, of course, the work of Jacques Derrida. And in many of his writings, he talks about friendship, especially, of course, his very well-known Politics of Friendship. But I was most attracted to this essay of his, which he titles Hospitality, where he shows that the ideas of hospitality and hostility share a common troubling origin with the idea of hostis, which can be a marker of hospitality to the other, but also that hospitality is always threatened by the possibility of hostility. And as Derrida famously said, that friendship is only possible alongside the wound of enmity. So there, what I was getting at in terms of trying to put these fragments from Western philosophical traditions on the question of friendship, primarily looking at friendship as both a promise and a peril, something that promises hospitality but can also engender hostility, um, if one is bound with a harmful friend for that matter. So, how can one put these philosophical reflections on the idea of friendship in Western philosophical thought with ways in which the question of friendship has also been imagined in Muslim intellectual traditions? And there, the main category that I'm dealing with in this book is this category of muwalat, Muwalat, which of course comes from the roots waliya in Arabic, from which we get terms like wali or awliya, friends of God, Sufi masters, as we call them in the Western Academy. But interestingly, this idea of wali or wilaya or walaya, connected terms that are connected to the roots waliya, also index the idea of sovereign power, of sovereignty. Wali is someone who's not only close and is a friend, but the wali can also be the sovereign authority over subjects and so on. Even God describes himself in Surah Al-Baqarah as the guardian of the faithful, drawing on this particular category. So, what I was interested in was the question of when Muslims lose their political sovereignty from the late 18th all the way to the late 19th century and onwards, in this transition from uh, the early modern period. So, basically, the book is divided, covers the time frame of the mid 18th to the mid 20th century. So, in this time period, which is marked by the gradual but decisive loss of Muslim political sovereignty, how does the promise and peril of interreligious friendship, especially Hindu-Muslim friendship, becomes the grounds for competing articulations of Muslim sovereign power in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty? And the main argument of the book is that, regardless of what opinion particular scholars might have held, more sort of hospitable to the idea of Hindu-Muslim friendship, or acrimonious to this idea, or unamenable to this idea, regardless of what kinds of opinions individual Muslim scholars held on the question of Hindu-Muslim friendship, at stake and at work in their arguments for the limits of interreligious friendship in Islam, especially Hindu-Muslim friendship in South Asian Islam, were competing understandings, competing visions of sovereign power in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty. So that is the way in which the relationship between friendship and sovereignty becomes a central conceptual sort of theme or glue of the book that strings together its 6 chapters. I'll maybe pause there and we can develop this further.
Right. Well, of course, the subtitle of the book also has Debating Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire. And of course, by empire here, you're referring to imperial Muslim context. And of course, you also talk about a key theme or a key thread throughout your book and throughout the various chapters is that of imperial Muslim political theology.
Right.
Now, as you just mentioned, this is something that is emerging in the absence of empire or in the absence of Muslim sovereignty. So one question before we go into the details of this discourse is uh, these discussions which you are considering are in the aftermath of Muslim sovereignty. But what would have the discussion or the discourse been like in the presence of Muslim sovereignty? How is this new discourse different from the previous one?
So that's a great question. So, with this idea of an imperial Muslim political theology, obviously the pre-modern tradition is extremely diverse and multifaceted, and Muslim intellectual discourses on the question of interreligious friendship or the logics of Muslim political sovereignty, whether that is caliphal sovereignty or imperial sovereignty, shifts and changes over time depending on different conditions. So I don't mean to sort of paint some kind of a generalized brush on the entirety of the pre-modern Muslim intellectual and political traditions, but rather what I was after with that category was this understanding of uh, the relationship between the self and the other, premised on the normative desirability of maintaining Muslim distinction and superiority over the other in a fashion that brings together the idea of theological sovereignty with that of political power over the other. And this is basically the kind of context in which the formative years of the classical Muslim legal traditions, including that of the Hanafi legal school, which is predominant in South Asia, can be found. So these, Muslim legal texts on questions of interreligious relations, friendship, the kinds of provisions which might be afforded to minority populations under Muslim political rule, or the kinds of rules and stipulations for a Muslim community that has come under non-Muslim rule, or that finds itself as a minority population under non-Muslim rule. So, in terms of the legal rulings on these kinds of questions, regardless of what those legal rulings actually might be, but and keeping in consideration the varieties and the differences of different Muslim legal scholars on these questions, nonetheless, this legal framework was informed by the assumption of a Muslim political authority and sovereignty. That is the foundational context for the emergence of the Muslim legal canon, including that of Hanafi law. So one thing that I was interested in was this question of how do Muslim scholars then, I'll come to your question of what it would have been under Muslim political sovereignty in a moment, but let me just complete this thought. The question I was interested in was, in what ways then does the uh, scholarly elite of a community, in this case, the Muslim community, how did the Muslim intellectual elite engage with the resources of a tradition, the legal texts, theological texts, etc., especially on interreligious difference and friendship, when the very political context informing that tradition, informing that reservoir of texts and those discourses was no longer available? And then what kinds of encounters do we find between the legacy of that, Muslim intellectual tradition in the pre-modern period, and then the conditions, the categories, and the expectations of British colonial modernity? That encounter, that interaction between these two discursive and political universes, how does that present itself as a site of tremendous intellectual fermentation, creativity, debate, competing visions of what should South Asian Muslim identity constitute? So that basically became, that encounter became the central arena of analysis for me in terms of staging the theoretical uh, uh, operations of this project. So, I mean, of course, this will have to be a counter sort of factual history about what things would look like in under Muslim political sovereignty. So, one thing that one should mention in that regard is that, of course, these questions of interreligious friendship and difference are not inventions of the modern period. They have been there for a long time. In the 18th century, in the 17th century, I mean, for example, I have a whole chapter on the question of cow sacrifice and how it might be negotiated with religious sensitivities of the Hindu population. So that was an important question even in the pre-modern period. I mean, even during Akbar's reign, he had, of course, prohibited cow slaughter out of regard for Hindu sensitivities, for which he got tremendous backlash. So there are different episodes that we find in the pre-modern period. I think what is different in the modern period are a few things. One is the sheer intensity and proliferation of these sorts of debates on the question of how do we think about Muslim sovereign power, and how do we think about Muslim identity and what it will be based on when the resurrection of Muslim political sovereignty is no longer a viable possibility. So just the proliferation and the intensity of these discourses and debates is something quite novel in the modern period. Um, in the pre-modern period, we do have instances of such debates, but this anxiety and urgency over recovering some kind of sovereign agency over your religious life as an individual or as a community is perhaps not as urgent as we might find it in the early modern and modern periods. The other main difference, of course, uh, is that uh, in these debates, the degree to which everyday life becomes one of the central theaters of the question of what will be the boundaries and limits of Hindu-Muslim friendship. So, questions of uh, can Muslims participate in Hindu rituals and everyday, not every day, but like devotional rituals and festivals like Diwali and Holi? How should we think about the spatial geographies of particular, towns and cities in terms of the relationship between temples and mosques. Um, so, for example, one of the things that the leaders of those who opposed it, rather, the leaders of the Khilafat movement were most incensed by, such as the founder of the Barelvi school, Ahmad Raza Khan, uh, died 1920, whom I talked about in several of the chapters, in fact, at least three of the six chapters. I mean, he was most incensed by the leaders of the Khilafat movement having invited Gandhi to the pulpit during one of the Friday congregational prayers. So the very idea of how the spatial and the physical geographies of everyday life must be choreographed in a manner that maintains and preserves Muslim distinction over the other. This kind of palpable anxiety over everyday life as a touchstone of religious authenticity and Muslim sovereign power is also something I think which is much more uh, predominant and much more prominent in the modern period. So that connects, in fact, to another main argument of the book as well. And on that note, I will close. One of the main arguments of the book is that for many prominent and influential Muslim scholars of early modern and modern South Asia, with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty and with the impossibility of the resurrection of a Muslim state, it is everyday ritual life, the practice of everyday life, that emerges as a synecdoche for sovereign power. That sort of domain of religious life becomes the main site uh, in which competing visions of Muslim sovereign power are negotiated, contested, and debated. So that, in some ways, is another major argument of the book. What kinds of alternate framings and understandings of sovereign power emerge after the loss of Muslim political sovereignty? And the interesting thing there, to punctuate, is that paradoxically, with the loss of Muslim political sovereignty and with the absence of a Muslim state, we have a much more expansive notion of sovereign power that is not territorial, which is not bound to the institution of the state, of the modern state, but is rather connected to this urgent project of maintaining Muslim distinction over the other. And in the maintenance of that Muslim distinction over the other, which one has to strive for by doing what? By preserving what are called the markers of Muslim distinction, this key category of the book called Shi'ar-e Islam or Sha'air-e Islam. So this idea of shi'ar or a distinctive marker of Islam in rituals like cow sacrifice and so on, that basically becomes the main arena or domain of life where Muslim sovereign power is increasingly located and contested after the loss of Muslim political sovereignty.
So this concern with or this emphasis on preserving the shi'ar of Islam or the distinct characteristic of Islam would not have been exaggerated in a pre-modern context. Is that right?
Well, yeah, of course, this category, of course, has a much longer life. It comes all the way from the Quran when it is invoked in relation to practices like the Hajj and so on, Muslim rituals. And this, of course, has a much longer kind of genealogy and trajectory. I guess my argument would be that the degree to which the sha'air and the shi'ar become objects of contestation, the intensity, the degree, the proliferation, and the urgency with which this becomes the underlying site for uh, understandings of what is religious identity, authenticity, and sovereign power, that is something from my readings of 17th, 18th, 19th, early 20th century, is something that we see increasingly punctuated from the early 19th all the way on to the late 19th century. And why is that the case? I mean, my working hypothesis is that one of the reasons why that is the case is precisely that in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty, the very idea of politics, the very idea of what kind of a polis, what kind of a community one ought to cultivate becomes increasingly invested in the regulation and the management of the choreography of everyday Muslim ritual life. So that is basically what I would say to that.
Right, right. Speaking of the pre-modern context, you have a quite an extensive select genealogy of Indian Muslim translations of Hinduism in the first chapter of your book.
Yeah.
Uh, So, can you give us a brief overview of these various approaches that we find in this history?
Yeah. So, that chapter, of course, is mostly focused on the context of the middle of the 18th century, looking at this one Sufi master and scholar, Mirza Mazhar Jane Jana, died 1781, and his meditations on Hindu thought and practice. But as a way to sort of contextualize his translation work, I wanted to give a broad overview of Muslim intellectual projects of trying to translate Hindu thought, practices, doctrines for Muslim audiences that we might find in medieval and early modern South Asia. And in this chapter, my main sort of concern is to think about the relationship between translation and friendship. Taking Jacques Derrida's cue that translation is the condition of all hospitality, how one translates the other is always connected to the question of what view of the other does one have in terms of the degree of hospitality that one might accord and afford to the other. Uh, so, in that respect, this kind of overview that I present also considers the extensive Western scholarship now that has been conducted on this topic. I mean, it provides fragments of it. It's not a comprehensive overview, that would have been impossible. But some of the major recent work that has been done in this field of study. And then I also look at a couple of Persian manuscripts that I stumbled upon that do some very interesting work that had not been examined before. So let me give you some kind of examples from both of these domains. I mean, when it comes to the whole question of Indian Muslim translations of Hinduism, of course, the name with which one often begins, and name with which I also begin my inquiry, is that of Al-Biruni and his famous book Kitabul Hind, which, of course, is as fascinating as it is contested and controversial. And there, I mean, there is an interesting sort of Western scholarship on this topic of Al-Biruni's expositions on Hindu thought and practice. That on the one hand, there have been scholars, Ainsley Embry, of course, the famous translator of this text, and then later on, of course, someone like Carl Ernst has examined and written about this quite a bit, Bruce Lawrence back in the day as well. And for many of these scholars, one of their main arguments has been that the kind of way in which Al-Biruni presents Hinduism and Hindu thought and practice in some kind of a unitary fashion as having some kind of essences that can then be evaluated. And the note with which he begins his exposition, of course, famously, I mean, I will paraphrase it, but that they have their own traditions, they have their own doctrines, and they are completely separate and completely alien to Islam. But then, of course, he does this very intensively uh, 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 documentarian, even if at times unsympathetic, examination of Hindu thought practices, doctrines, and among many other topics that he examines. So there has been the argument that, when we talk about this kind of million-dollar question in South Asian religions about is Hinduism a modern category, or the relationship between the conditions of British colonial modernity and the emergence of this world religion called Hinduism. And there are many scholars on both sides of this debate, and it's a whole spectrum about the question of continuity and rupture in relation to the category of Hinduism. Is 19th century Hinduism broadly a continuity from the pre-modern past, or is it some kind of an exceptional rupture? This, of course, is a very contested question. So many scholars have actually pointed to Al-Biruni as a good example of a pre-modern figure who basically becomes a lot more prominent and famous come modernity, precisely because his translation framework in which and the way in which he examined Hinduism uh, corresponded with, or had a similitude with, or was analogous to later British colonial approaches to Hindu thought and practice. This is an argument that, of course, Carl Ernst has made quite forcefully in his famous and a must-read article of his. I think it's called Indian Muslim translations or examinations of Hindu thought. I have cited it in the book for those who might be interested. But then more recently, there has been a scholar, Mario Cosa, who wrote a really brilliant book on Al-Biruni, and basically looking at his translations of Patanjali. And he basically showed that, in fact, when Al-Biruni goes about translating and examining Yoga Sutras of Patanjali in what he called Kitab Patanjal, he basically, in fact, is animated by an intra-Muslim debate in which he is engaged in a debate with his adversary, Avicenna or Ibn Sina, on the whole question of the relationship between matter and the body. And basically, his translation of Patanjali becomes the site through which he, in fact, throws his philosophical arrows and ammunition at Ibn Sina, and this site of interreligious translation was a much more hospitable site to do this kind of intra-Muslim philosophical work without the kind of baggage of personal faith and convictions being tied to when you are translating and examining the other. And that's a very interesting and convincing argument, which sort of shows us that, yes, there might be some analogous qualities between al-Biruni's examination of Hinduism and then later British colonial examinations of Hinduism. But al-Biruni was also engaged in an intra-Muslim philosophical conversation on the whole relationship between the matter and body. So he should not always be looked at as some kind of a proto-modernist when it comes to this question. So the other sort of scholars who I look at in this survey are people like Al-Girdezi, Shahrastani, Amir Khusro, who did not give a blanket evaluation on the legitimacy or illegitimacy of Hinduism, but looked at particular sort of fragments and specific aspects of it, depending on what they consider to be the most important uh, 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 quality or characteristics of Hinduism. And then the one text that I examine, and there are a number of other examples that I won't get into in the interest of time, but one text that I sort of examine on my own is this fascinating Persian text, which is only available in a manuscript form, um, uh, uh, called Hujjatul Hind, the Proof of India, by a certain Omar Mehrabi. And this is a really fascinating text where this scholar, about whom we don't really know much, he could either be a 15th century scholar or a 17th century, even the date of his text and his life is not settled yet. But he basically stages this extensive conversation between a parrot and a crane, where the crane asks the parrot all these theological, philosophical questions, and the parrot answers these questions. And the main audience member for this whole conversation is a Hindu princess named Dimishti, who is, although Hindu, although she is the daughter of some Hindu notable and noble called Raja Rai Karan, I believe. Um, and Dimishti basically, although she's a Hindu, she's very perturbed, she's very anxious about the truthfulness of her own religion. So she witnesses this conversation, theological conversation between the parrot and the crane. And it basically is a very polemical text, which really goes after many of the Hindu doctrines. It is very unsympathetic in many ways. It is a polemical text, which basically examines the whole question of is this landmass, is this place worthy of prophethood, worthy of prophecy? And through a number of different examples and forms of argument, the main argument of the text is that in fact India is not worthy of prophecy and prophethood, and he gives a number of different examples in that regard. So this is a very dense but also a very fascinating polemical Persian text. And the interesting thing is that this is from either the 17th or the 15th century. So the point I try to make through my examination of this text is that the idea of having hardened attitudes or more quote unquote exclusivist attitudes towards Hindu thought and practice is not only a uh, feature that is specific to the modern period, even in the early modern period of the 17th or even the 15th century, this text existed, a deeply polemical Persian text in this kind of a fascinating theater of a conversation between a parrot and a crane, which in fact replicates the model and borrows heavily from Kubrawi Sufi traditions. Um, and specifically the text Mirsadul Ibad. Um, so these are some examples through which I try to contextualize my own main interest in this chapter, which is on Mirza Mazhar Janan.
Well, at one point in the book, you also mentioned that, I mean, in the context of Al-Biruni and how his approach may be characterized as being essentialist and being reified, or involving a reification of Hindu thought or Hindu traditions.
Mhm.
Uh, and you did also just now highlight some of the key differences
Right,
between that versus the colonial
right,
reification of religion, or
right,
the enterprise of religion making that
right,
we see in colonialism. Can you
right.
elaborate a little bit more on that exactly, and how and
Yeah,
why these two
yeah,
approaches might be seen as different, right?
yeah. No, that's a great question. And this is a question which is not only relevant for students of Islam or South Asian Islam, but more broadly, anyone interested in the question of religion and colonialism. So, Saad, in that respect, you know, uh, even with someone like Mirza Madar Jane Janan, that I get into the latter half of the chapter, his translation of Hinduism is incredibly sympathetic and to the point of being admiring and endorsing the intellectual sophistication and the scholastic sort of complexity of Hindu knowledge traditions. And he basically draws all these equivalences between Islamic law and theology and what he calls Hindu law and theology by translating um, uh, Dharma Shastra as the knowledge of jurisprudence, ilmul fiqh, and then translating Karma Shastra as dialectical theology, ilmul kalam in Islam, and so on. And on a number of other topics as well. He's extremely sympathetic. And with someone like El-Biruni, of course, he is relying on a certain kind of an essentialist or a certain kind of a unitary understanding of Hinduism. So my main point, um, in terms of the relationship or the comparison between later British colonial translations of a category like Hinduism and these either early modern or medieval approaches to Hinduism coming from the Muslim intellectual tradition, there are some seeming similarities. The privileging of law in the case of Mirza Madar Jane Janan as the main site of authenticity, which was, of course, the case with colonial authorities as well in terms of trying to privilege a text like the Laws of Manu, which was one of the major objects of translation for British colonial Orientalists and authorities, and that is also the case in Mirza Madar Jane Janan. The one text that he draws on most in translating the Hindu other is the Laws of Manu. Um, this whole emphasis on establishing the monotheism of Hinduism. So Mirza Madar Jane Janan in his examination goes out of his way in trying to say that the idol worship that you find among the Hindus is in no way related to what we find among pre-Islamic pagans, because the pre-Islamic pagans basically would consider the idols as being effective and agentive in and of themselves, whereas Hindus only, engage in a form of reverence, which does not depend on those idols having their own agency in and of themselves, the objects themselves, and so on, and many other cases. So we look at these possible uh, similarities between these two discursive universes, and it might be tempting to say that people like Mirza Madar Jane Janan or even Al-Biruni much earlier were basically proto-colonialists or proto-modernists on this question. But the main difference in terms of these two discursive streams is that the colonial translation of Hinduism as a major world religion and its presentation of Hinduism as a religious club was inextricably bound to the sovereignty and the governance of the colonial state. That there was in this whole translation project, intimately tied to it was the whole idea of maintaining and establishing the governance and sovereignty of the state. Whereas the translation of someone like Mirza Madar Jane Janan is not animated by the question of governance and the operations of the modern state, but rather it is informed by the question of community. How should members of my community understand the members of this other community in a manner that would be intellectually sympathetic and coherent? So the maintenance of the integrity of human relations in a community, in terms of the relationship between these two communities of Hindus and Muslims, is very different from the kind of colonial logics of translation, where clearly translation is connected to maintaining the imperial sovereignty and the governance of the modern state. Um, so that in some ways is one of the major differences. The other major differences is that the evaluation or sympathetic reading of someone like Mirza Jane Janan is not uh, premised on some kind of modern notions of tolerance or secularism, of respecting the other out of some kind of a secular ethos, but it is very much grounded in the traditions, in the logics of Islamic law and theology. And that Mirza Mazhar Jane Janan is able to do, for example, by on the one hand being extremely sympathetic to Hinduism, and by drawing all these equivalences between Islamic law and theology and Hindu law and theology, and exonerating Hindus on questions like idol worship, on questions like were prophets ever sent to India, in which he says that they may well have been sent to India, and he cites the Quran and the verses in the Quran where some of the messengers and the prophets sent to different places in the world is left unmentioned. منهم من قصصنا عليك ومنهم من لم نقصص عليك, that famous Quranic verse. Some of the messengers we've mentioned in the Quran, and some of them we have not mentioned in the Quran. So Jane Janan says that those who have not been mentioned may well have been prophets and messengers who were sent to a place like India. But despite all that, he maintains his commitment to, he maintains his attachment to an exceptional view of Islam by basically arguing that this is only true, his analysis of the intellectual coherence and legitimacy of Hindu knowledge traditions and Hindu doctrines until the coming of Islam. And the coming of Islam in the 7th century basically becomes a temporal line, a temporal demarcator between identity and difference, heresy and belief. So this kind of juxtaposition of someone like Mirza Mazhar Jane Janan, juxtaposition of a sympathetic reading of the religious other, while nonetheless grounded in, an imperial notion of Islam, an imperial notion of Islamic exceptionalism, is very different from a modern notion of tolerance or the secular, which is always connected to, which is always integrated with and integral to the maintenance of the sovereignty of the modern state and its imperative of the governance of religious minorities or religious communities, rather, in a multi-religious society. So hence, there are similarities, but there are also some major differences because of which we can't conflate someone like Jana Janan or Al-Biruni with a modern logic of religion making, as you correctly pointed out.
Right. Thank you. Well, again, this is also slightly tangential, what I'm going to suggest, but if you could perhaps elaborate slightly more on what is it exactly that is happening in the modern nation state in terms of uh, regulating religion that is not there in the other contexts that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, no, this is a very important question, in fact. As many scholars have pointed out, and I think quite correctly, um, look, there are, of course, many continuities between the pre-modern and the modern periods. There's no question about that. And sometimes, in this whole debate of continuity and rupture, uh, in this book, I try to sort of open up new problem spaces as well, sort of going beyond this debate. But this debate is important and does continue to provide intellectual fodder for productive conversations and debates. That sometimes in trying to oppose this view of rupture, oppose this view of the modern colonial sort of significance of modern colonial power in the reconfiguration of religion and religious identities in places like South Asia, there can be some kind of a polemical tendency to caricature this view as if all of these things are just the invention of the modern period or some kind of complete, absolute rupture from the past. And that is not the case. I mean, of course, these traditions and these discourses have continuities. But the major rupture, of course, I think can be nicely captured by someone like Sudipta Kaviraj's very helpful set of two categories of what he calls fuzzy and enumerated identities, where the idea of enumerated identity that he associates with the modern colonial period is basically a notion of identity which, as the category suggests, is much more enumerated, much more ideologically uh, um, clarified, where the whole difference between the self and the other can be inserted into things like the modern census, where people, you knock on the door, you open the door, which box are you in, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, etc. So that is one way in which we can think about the rupture of the colonial modernity, and especially the kind of machineries of the colonial state in terms of how mechanisms and operations like things like the census becomes one of the major grounds for the emergence of enumerated notions and visions of religious identity. The other way in which we can think about this moment as constituting an important rupture um, is, of course, the way in which knowledge production, and especially the work of translation, becomes integral to uh, horizons of the modern colonial state. So here I find very useful. Um, sorry, my camera is frozen a bit. I find very useful the category which is presented by a scholar like Arvind Mandir in his famous book on Sikhism and colonialism called Religion and the Spectre of the West, where he draws on Derrida to talk about this idea of what he calls monotheolingualism. And I think this is a very useful point of why is it that in the modern period we see the kind of confluence between this idea of an increased emphasis on monotheism in sort of Hindu reform movements and Sikh reform movements, and even in Islam for that matter. When it comes to these reform movements, of course, many of them were animated by this urgency and anxiety of trying to establish the absoluteness of divine sovereignty, which they saw being threatened by the practice of Muslim ritual life. This basically was the main argument that I made in my first book, Defending Muhammadan Modernity. So this monotheism and then monolingualism in terms of how each community sort of begins to say that, I'm Hindu, my language is Hindi, I'm Muslim, my language is Urdu, and so on. So how all of those kinds of operations of the hardening of religious distinction is deeply connected to the mechanisms and the machineries of the modern state in terms of, things like the census, things like, new kinds of laws to do with the maintenance of public order, the MPOs, which are still, of course, used in South Asia in very horrific and problematic ways, of how that becomes the manner to undermine and maintain and manage basically religious difference in the public sphere. So I think these are some of the mechanisms through which the very secular promise of establishing the secular as the other of religion, rather than thinking of the secular as only the opposite or the inverse of religion or the more commonplace understanding of the secular. But if we think of secular power and the secular as a form of power that constantly regulates and defines what gets counted as religion, then we can see ways in which colonial projects of knowledge production, translations that go into the making of things like the Anglo-Mohammedan law, that go into the translations of texts like laws of Manu, the emergence of this monotheolingualism that I'm talking about, that all of these things combined are, at the end of the day, connected to and are at the service of the operations and maintenance of colonial state sovereignty. Now, that sovereignty, of course, is marred by all kinds of contradictions, but nonetheless, the power of the modern state sovereignty in terms of bringing together these different operations of the secular in the modern period is, I think, quite distinctive from pre-modern forms of imperial sovereignty. I mean, Sudipta Kaviraj puts it very nicely where he says that, the very relationship between the people and the state goes through a massive transformation. And through people being loosely connected to an imperial state, this idea that in some ways the state represents the sovereign will of the people, and the kind of ways in which the modern state then goes about regulating the bodies and the lives of people, and especially when it comes to things like religious categories and identities, is, I think, an important rupture from the past. So, the argument has never been that it's a complete rupture or a complete novelty. There are, of course, continuities from the pre-modern period as well, but the ruptures and the discontinuities are significant enough that I think they need to be considered in any kind of analysis on the question of religion in South Asia.
Right. Well, thank you. I think that's a very useful or a very necessary clarification when we think about these things. Well, to bring up one further central motif of your book, which is, of course, the anxiety about the self and the other. And of course, you have a whole chapter on what is termed tashabbuh or reprehensible imitation, where you also again present a select genealogy of certain key debates around this category in Muslim scholarship in general, as well as in South Asian Muslim scholarship.
Right.
So can you take us through that?
Yeah, I mean, tashabbuh is an excellent category to reflect on the main conceptual question of this book, which is the encounter between pre-modern Muslim categories, concepts, and desires intimately entangled with the political condition of Muslim political sovereignty, and then the new conditions and categories and expectations of British colonial modernity. How does that encounter uh, uh, plays out when it comes to these questions of existential significance, like the preservation of the self in relation to the other? So this idea of tashabbuh, of course, or the reprehensible imitation of the religious other, comes from this famous hadith of the Prophet, saying of the Prophet, "Man tashabbaha biqawmin fahuwa minhum." Whoever imitates a people becomes one of them. And in this actually there are two chapters, 5 and 6, which are that deal with this question of tashabbuh. I was interested in the question of how does tashabbuh then becomes the grounds for both varied articulations of Muslim sovereign power, and also becomes the grounds for uh, some of the major ideological divisions among the Muslim scholarly elite, especially divisions between Muslim modernism and traditionalism that we find in the late 19th century, even in the early and mid-20th century, and its reverberations we feel until today, in fact, in India and in Pakistan and diaspora communities around the world. This division between the schools and also the thought styles of Aligarh and Deoband. So hence the last chapter is, about the Aligarh-Deoband divide, of how tashabbuh becomes the main grounds for very far-reaching debates and consequences of how we might imagine Islam and tradition in the conditions of colonial modernity, and after that, the post-colonial nation states. Uh, so the interesting thing with this category is that the way in which I look at it in chapter 5, which provides this kind of a genealogy of this category as it is explored and examined by Muslim scholars from different ideological camps, uh, is that the way in which they talk about tashabbuh is oftentimes connected to ways in which they imagine Muslim sovereign power in conditions of colonial modernity. So, for example, the interesting thing about this category is that even opposing camps of ulamas, for example, the Deobandi ulama and the Barelvi ulama, this kind of existential rivals, when it comes to this question, they're actually quite similar in terms of their diagnosis of Muslim practices in everyday life. It's deeply gendered and is especially, excoriating of Muslim women participating in rituals like Diwali and Holi. There are all these discussions of how should Muslim vendors, Muslim, people in Muslims in the police, etc., conduct themselves when it comes to their participation or their, attendance at Hindu festivals. So interestingly, we find both this kind of a highly gendered anxiety over preserving the body of the Muslim female from the harm and from the contagion of these rituals connected to the religious other, while also this interest in maintaining a hierarchy of religious authority. So if someone like Ahmad Raza Khan, when he talks about can Muslim vendors, can Muslim policemen, etc., go to these kinds of Hindu festivals, so he basically concludes that whole kind of discussion by making a distinction between a Muslim scholar going to these kinds of places and then Muslim sort of common folk going to such places, the latter being prohibited, while the former not being prohibited because the Muslim scholar can handle those kinds of, the salacious content and the kind of heretical content that we find at these kinds of venues, and can also use these venues for their missionary activity. Another very interesting thing that comes about when it comes to discourses on tashabbuh, for example, the famous scholar of the Deoband school, perhaps most prolific scholar, SherAli Tareen, dies 1943. So, on the question of tashabbuh, he basically argues that him and, of course, the founder of Deoband, Maulana Rashid Ahmad Gangohi, died 1906, both of them argue that, while wearing English hats in India is reprehensible imitation, similarly, if Muslims wear an English hat within England, that would not be reprehensible. And the logic is quite interesting because in India, this is wearing the English hat is something specific to a non-Muslim community, the British. It's their marker of distinction, their shi'ar. So this category of shi'ar, interestingly, is not only used in the context of Islam and Muslims, but also in relation to non-Muslim populations and entities. So it's their marker of Muslim distinction, marker of distinction. But in England, everyone is wearing a hat. So if Muslims wear hats over there, that would not be seen as some kind of a marker of distinction of a specific community. So that's a very interesting statement, and which shows that deeply integral to the whole question of tashabbuh or reprehensible imitation is the very idea of that which is seen as taboo, that which is seen as particularly connected with another religious community. And the reason for that is that basically the idea of tashabbuh, the centerpiece of this when it comes to ulama discourses on this idea, is that tashabbuh is seen as the kind of imitation. Now, why is imitation so problematic? Why is imitation such a question of existential theological significance for these scholars? And an articulation of that we find perhaps in its most detailed form, the most detailed examination of this category in South Asian Islam, we find in a text which was authored by Maulana Qari Tayyib, who of course died in the 1980s, who is the grandson of Maulana Muhammad Qasim Nanotwi, the other key founder of Deoband, died 1877. And Qari Tayyib has an extensive and a really magisterial and dense but very productive text called Reprehensible Imitation in Islam, At-Tashabbuh fil Islam. And in that text, he basically explains that imitation is the first step to the evisceration of one's religious identity and the identity of the community. How? Because imitation is the path through which the distinction of identity becomes camouflaged, becomes confused, becomes mixed with the other. So this whole idea of the way that he talks about it is that distinction, or what he calls imtiaz, would be erased by mixture or ikhtilat, or mixture and confusion, iltibas. So this whole idea of the confusion of identity, the confusion of particular forms of identity, is then connected to a larger metaphysical assumption and discourse, whereby the ontological form of any entity, its survival and its existence depends on distinction. So, for example, someone like Qari Tayyib talks about ways in which a lion is called a lion, or a lion is a lion because of the certain qualities which are associated with the lion and the way in which the lion looks, and can be seen from the outside. So if a lion begins to behave like a goat or begins to look like a goat, the ontological integrity of that category of life, the lion, will be eviscerated. So another very sort of poignant example that he gives is that in the battlefield, if someone is wearing the uniform of the opposing army, no matter how much he is from your own army, you would consider that person from the opposing army because he's wearing the uniform of the opposing army and so on. So that's how, for someone like Qari Tayyib, external forms and the functions that are associated with any kind of an entity depends on maintaining the distinction of the ontological external form of that entity. And when the external ontological form of an entity becomes confused, or it becomes mixed with the other, that basically is the first step towards the evisceration of the integrity of the self and by extension that of the community. So very interestingly, on this question of shi'ar, someone, for example, asked, not any someone, actually the founder of Aligarh, Sayyid Ahmad Khan, the famous Muslim modernist, posed the question of uh, uh, even the Prophet used to wear robes or used to wear clothing, made by Roman Christians, at times even made by Jews of Yemen or other places, etc. So even the Prophet wore clothing and items of non-Muslims. And if he did not have a problem with it, that why are we creating such a big fuss about these kinds of questions of external appearance and questions of maintaining distinction from the non-Muslim other? So on that point, in rebutting Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and Tashabbuh fil Islam really is an extensive rebuttal of Sayyid Ahmad Khan's views on Tashabbuh and his larger view of civilizational progress as articulated in Tahzibul Akhlaq, the famous journal associated with, I should say, authored by Sayyid Ahmad Khan. So one of the main things that Qari Tayyib, among other very fascinating details that he presents in rebutting this kind of a viewpoint, is that he makes the argument that the robes, or the jubba kasrawani, this idea, the Roman cloak rather, or robe, that was worn by the Prophet, that only had functional significance. That robes which were made at that time were made by the Roman Christians, or a certain kind of scarf which was made by Jews were made by the Jews. So functionally, these are items which were produced and manufactured by these religious communities, and that was only a functional adoption, a kind of a functional embodiment of those cloaks, of that shawl, etc., connected to the non-Muslim community. But it was not a shi'ar of the non-Muslim community. It was not particular to that non-Muslim community. It was only functionally related to them, as they were the main manufacturers of that product. So he basically says that, in British India, for example, Pears soap is manufactured by the British. So if Muslims, use that as part of their ablutions or while bathing, they're not imitating the non-Muslim other, because basically the British are only the manufacturers of that product or entity. So the ambiguity in this whole kind of framing then becomes, at what point does a particular object of clothing or a particular product or way of external appearance, at what point does that cease to be only functionally related to a non-Muslim other and becomes a marker of that non-Muslim other's identity, becomes a shi'ar, becomes a distinctive marker of the other, such that if you then adopt it, you will be confusing, you will be obliterating the integrity of the self. So that ambiguity Qari Tayyib does not answer. But it's very interesting, this kind of anxiety over the maintenance of distinction is basically connected to a larger metaphysics of maintaining the integrity and the distinction of the ontological form of every kind of entity. So for Sayyid Ahmad Khan, tashabbuh and these kinds of discourses basically were an impediment to civilizational progress, because he basically argued in his text, what is the main purpose of this doctrine? Other than saying that it's a weak hadith and so on, which Qari Tayyib rebuts by drawing on Ibn Taymiyyah in his famous book, Al-Iqtada fi Sirat al-Mustaqim, Iqtada Sirat al-Mustaqim. So on that question of the whole, the sanad, the isnad of this chain of transmission, he rebuts by drawing on Ibn Taymiyyah. But on this other question of, what is the use of this? What is the utility of this? What is the function of this whole practice? Basically, Sayyid Ahmad Khan's main argument was, but so what on this whole question? He basically said that if the Prophet was born in the UK, in Germany, he would have adopted their practices. So why are we being so sort of fussed about this particular question? And their Qari Tayyib's main answer was to this kind of a modernist sort of a smug dismissal of this category. That what is at stake here is the integrity of Muslim identity. And he basically makes the argument that, if you go into a gathering in which you are sort of cross-dressed, and wearing partly male clothing, partly female clothing, everyone will be looking at you with the, eyes of disparagement, and it would be a cause of embarrassment. So why would you not consider the whole idea of, wearing a fez hat and then Western clothing to also be this kind of a confused and mixed ontological form that should also be a cause of embarrassment and disparagement, which is, of course, him taking a swipe at the famous image of Sayyid Ahmad Khan as someone who was able to bring together Western and Eastern, lives and geographies through his clothing. So what to Sayyid Ahmad Khan was a marker of civilizational progress, or a way to keep open and being open to other forms of life and possibilities. To someone like Qari Tayyib was precisely the kind of confusion, the kind of mixture, the kind of queering, as we might call it, of identity, which is only the first step towards the evisceration of the self and by extension of the community. So it's a question of existential significance. But my main sort of interest in these two chapters was, how does the question of tashabbuh become the grounds for competing views of what South Asian Islam and Muslim identity should constitute in the colonial modern period, and how then it becomes the main arena for these competing ideologies within Islam, within South Asian Islam, especially in relation to the fault lines of Muslim traditionalism and modernism, as we see in terms of the debate between the pioneers of Aligarh and Deoband.
Right. And of course, I mean, in this whole discussion, you also have a very interesting few pages on the novel Ibn al-Waqt by Nazir Ahmed Dahlawi.
Right.
So can you briefly tell us what this novel has to tell us about the relationship between Islam, religious difference, and modernity?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Iqtada Sirat al-Mustaqim, obviously. The text of Ibn Taymiyyah. So Nazir Ahmad Dahlawi and his novella Ibn al-Waqt is a fascinating novella, and it's really wonderfully written as well. And one of the things that I really wanted to do by bringing in someone like Nazir Ahmad Dahlawi into the conversation is to show that a literator like him And a novelist like him was deeply grounded in and intimately familiar with ulama or traditionalist knowledge traditions and the ulama milieu, social and intellectual, as was someone like Sayyid Ahmad Khan, and hence he became such an antagonist for the traditionalist class, because he was basically the other who knew the vocabulary and the protocols of the self. Similarly, with Abul Kalam Azad, the other modernists I look at extensively in this book. So Ibn al-Waqt, of course, interestingly, this category, of course, again has a pre-modern life. Famously, of course, coming up in the Masnavi of Rumi. Um, uh, um, what does he say? Sufi Ibn al-Waqt bashad e Rafiq, nis farda guftan as shart-e tariq. So, the Sufi or the Sufi master is the son of the moment. Thinking about tomorrow, saying tomorrow is not a condition to be on the path. Which basically, of course, connects to this whole idea of the importance of the intense presence that a Sufi practitioner must have to be on that path or the tariqah of Sufism. But in the hands of someone like Nazir Ahmad Dehlvi, Ibn al-Waqt basically takes on a different kind of a meaning, which is someone who is so intensely connected to the present that he becomes an opportunist. And this whole novel, of course, is set in the post-1857 era, where this figure called Ibn al-Waqt, who in many ways also biographically also has a lot of deep resemblances with both Nazir Ahmad Dehlvi and Sayyid Ahmad Khan, for that matter. As someone who is trained in Muslim disciplines, goes to Delhi College, gets trained in disciplines of history, geography, and Arabic, and so on. But then, encounters a British colonial officer who was severely injured in the Bedlam connected to the 1857 mutiny. And he basically cares for him and how they strike a very close friendship. And through that friendship, he basically joins the colonial bureaucracy. And it's the whole novel, of course, is about how this guy, Ibn al-Waqt, is trying to sort of climb the ladder of civilizational progress by imitating the customs, the habits, and the forms of life associated with the politically powerful of the time, the British colonial elite. And he's a very complex character. He's very critical of British colonialism in its own way, in terms of how it was not able to understand Muslim grievances against it. But nonetheless, he is someone who's trying to bring together these two lives of being grounded in a Muslim upbringing, but then is also trying to climb the ladder of modernist progress by serving the colonial state and by adopting its habits, its customs, its practices, the use of forks and knives and Western cutlery and Western forms of dress and habits of eating and so on. And how that eventually, in the course of the novella, leads to his own destruction. And the interesting thing about the novella is that at one point, in one perspective, it's a critique of this whole idea of imitating the other, in this case, imitating the British colonial other, and this fantasy and desire to be like the more powerful other. So it is a critique of that whole idea. And tashabbuh as a category does come up even in the novella a few times. On the other hand, it is also a commentary on the relationship between power and identity, in that, throughout the novella, one of the main assumptions and logics that Nazir Ahmad Dehlvi articulates is that, when a community is politically powerful, people want to imitate it. So this whole idea of the relationship between, power and its importance for the maintenance of distinction, this whole idea of an imperial political theology that we associate with the pre-modern Muslim tradition, with which I sort of talk about the category of imperial Muslim political theology, that is also true for British colonial state, and how, its power basically becomes a way in which its distinction and its the attraction of its identity for the others becomes increasingly palpable. So I was interested in both these kinds of assumptions about politics and power, and then also ways in which the whole question of imitation becomes an important way in which a novella like Ibn al-Waqt tries to make a certain kind of argument about how should Muslims sort of interact with British colonial power and its forms of life and habits and practices, and the sort of larger kind of take-home points that this novella drives home in terms of the very relationship between politics, power, and religion. And for that, I found this an incredibly a useful and productive text. And I think it's important for scholars of religion to look at places like novels and poetry and other forms of literature for the articulation of these kinds of religious ideas and doctrines in very different kind of registers. So I think his inclusion in chapter 5 also provided kind of a multifaceted uh, um, presentation of how this critical category of Islamic thought gets discussed and mobilized in different genres of writing that includes literature as well.
One final theme, which or one final thread, which is seen throughout your whole book, and which you also mention in the epilogue, is that uh, well, I mean, all these, these various debates and discourses and these various thinkers, they cannot be reduced into predetermined and popular binaries like
Right.
inclusivist, exclusivist, pluralist, Puritan, modernist, traditionalist,
Right.
pro-colonial, anti-colonial, or violent and peaceful. Can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that? Yeah.
Yeah, let me talk about that with the help of an example.
Right.
So, chapters 3 and 4 are basically invested in and focused on the Khilafat movement, context of the early 20th century, where a group of Muslim scholars, including Muslim modernists and some ulama as well, came together to try to pressure the British colonial state to maintain the integrity and the territorial boundaries of the Ottoman state, which for them was the Ottoman Caliphate. And that, of course, they argued for by also arguing for a relationship of friendship with the Hindu community and especially with Gandhi and the Indian National Congress. So, and that precipitated a massive backlash and also major debate about, how do we think about interreligious friendship in relation to this triangular relationship between the British, the Hindus, and the Muslims. And the kind of opposing views that we saw in that whole debate, on the one hand, Abul Kalam Azad trying to argue, citing from the Quran, that Hindus are the kind of non-Muslims who have never attacked us, who have never thrown us out of our homes, who have never been belligerent towards us, and hence, as it is said in chapter 60, Surah Mumtahana, in verses 8 and 9, um, that God only forbids you to turn into friendship to those non-Muslims who do these kinds of aggressive, belligerent things, to argue for friendship with Hindus. But at the same time, he also argues that because the colonial state has trampled upon a matter of tremendous religious sensitivity for Muslims, the caliphate, it is the obligation of every Muslim in India, it's an individual obligation, fard ayn, that they pick up arms and engage in jihad against the British. Um, so on the one hand, this scholar seemingly has a more inclusive position of friendship with Hindus and so on, but on the other hand, he has this kind of very radical view that you have to, pick up arms against the British. And he also, argued that everyone should in fact migrate from India. Um, because India now for him has become Darul Harb, or an abode of non-Muslim rule. On the other hand, if you look at an opposing scholar like Maulana Ahmad Raza Khan, the founder of the Barelvi school, he, of course, is deeply troubled by this whole idea of Hindu-Muslim friendship and intimacy because he sees that as a major threat to the markers of Muslim distinction in everyday ritual life with practices like cow sacrifice and so on. So his main argument is that if you want to preserve these markers of distinction, these sha'air, you cannot engage in a relationship of friendship and intimacy with someone like Gandhi. But at the same time, this so-called exclusivist, more traditionalist scholar, he also says that engaging in jihad against the British, in fact, makes absolutely no sense. And he makes the pragmatic argument that taking on this kind of a powerful imperial force will only lead to your own self-destruction, which he also makes an argument from the Quran that you should not throw yourselves on the path of destruction. Um, so this is just one possible example among many other examples to show, and he also makes, Ahmad Raza Khan, the interesting distinction between what he calls a relationship of substantive friendship with the other, what he calls mawalat-e-haqiqiyya, and then a relationship of mere transactional relations, what he calls mujarrad-e-muamalat, or what he also calls masked friendship, mawalat-e-suwariya. That with the British, basically, you can take their funding, you can take their sort of help and support for the Muslim community, for Muslim schools, colleges, by basically categorizing it as mere transactional relations that you are engaged in through a masked relationship of friendship. So the point being that this kind of an exclusivist, seemingly exclusivist scholar is making the more pragmatic point of not engaging in a war against the non-Muslim other or maintaining transactional relations. So this is just one example among many examples that I provide throughout the book. Even someone like Jane Jana, on the one hand, he's very sympathetic towards Hinduism, but he also maintains his commitment to an exceptional view of Islam as the completor of history, that anything that came after this, including Hinduism, is illegitimate. Among many, many, with each and every scholar whom I look at in this book, regardless of which school of thought they might be a part of, I try to show ways in which their thought is too complicated, too complex to be reduced to these kinds of binaries of inclusive, exclusive, pro-Muslim, or pro-Hindu, or pro-British, modernist, traditionalist, secular, fundamentalist, and so on, and to really take seriously the complexity of their thought.
Well, just to maybe end with one question which we began with about imperial Muslim political theology. So this term, would you say that this is applicable to when you're using this term? Are you referring to? Of course, I mean, firstly, there is Muslim theology in the presence of Muslim empire, Muslim political sovereignty, and then there is, of course, the uh, legacy of this in post imperial times, or after the absence of Muslim political sovereignty. So I mean, what I take it is that you're we can talk about imperial Muslim political theology in both of these contexts, in one sense. And then, I mean, my question would be, isn't Muslim theology itself as a category not interlaced with this imperial political theology that we're talking about? Or I mean, is there any conception of Muslim theology which is devoid of this element?
So that's a good question. We have 3 minutes left, so I'll give you a rapid fire
Right.
answer. My main concern with this category of an imperial Muslim political theology is what are the is basically the intimate entanglement between the political conditions, context, and background assumptions that inform Muslim theological and legal discourses on the question of the relationship between the self and the other, on the question of interreligious friendship. So it is basically the intimate entanglement of political conditions and context, that of Muslim political sovereignty, that becomes the kind of almost a non-articulated assumption that goes into legal discourses and discussions on this particular question. So it's really this intimate entanglement that I'm talking about, and it's important to note that even in the absence of Muslim political uh, uh, sovereignty, there are then new ways of imagining what that sovereign power might represent. So the point I'm making here is that an imperial Muslim political theology, although it includes the idea of a Muslim political, empire, or a Muslim political structure of sovereignty, but it's not reduced to that idea. That in fact, it is precisely in the absence of Muslim political sovereignty, both in the pre-modern period and more recently, that the desire for recovering and the desire for assembling some notion of Muslim sovereign power can oftentimes be most intense and urgent. And that, I think, is one way to sort of combine and bring together the thought of someone like Ibn Taymiyyah and these Muslim intellectual scholars in South Asia, or the context of Muslim Spain, and these discussions that we see in the Maliki school of law on precisely these questions of Muslim non-Muslim relations. So this, I think, might give us a conceptual key to sort of unlock the kind of logics of life and hermeneutics at work in these Muslim intellectual discourses across time periods and across different spaces.
Right. Okay. So I had one final question. So, well, in the epilogue, you have some discussion on the figure of Javed Ahmed Ghamidi.
Mhm.
Okay. So, well, you mentioned that, for example, in the context of the whole category of Dar al-Harb and Dar al-Islam, Ghamidi is trying to makes the case that these are obsolete categories, and they don't apply in the modern period. So, where does such posturing stand in relation to the legacy of imperial Muslim political theology, would you say?
That's a great question. So, I mean, in the epilogue in relation to Javed Ahmed Ghamidi, I was talking about this really fascinating debate that sprung up in Pakistan around 2020, 2021, and sort of now is on the back burner. But this debate about the construction of a Hindu temple in Islamabad, um, and the whole question of can a Muslim state fund and sponsor this kind of place of worship for a non-Muslim community. And all kinds of arguments were being presented. And one of the major sort of forms of argument that we saw from the ulama and the traditionalist elite of Pakistan was that it is okay for, of course, non-Muslims to construct these places of worship, but for it to be uh, actively funded and sponsored by a Muslim state is something problematic, especially in the capital city of Islamabad, where some scholars, not really prominent traditionalist ulama, but some of them who were trained in both madrasas or Islamic seminaries and then modern universities as well, had made the argument that even in pre-modern Islam, was not able to construct places of non-Muslim worship in the Amsar or these garrison towns and so on, and trying to make this kind of an interesting comparison between Islamabad and garrison towns of Basra and so on. So in relation to that, then Javed Ahmed Ghamidi responded to that kind of a reaction by saying that these very categories of pre-modern Islamic law, this very distinction of geographies into or divisions of geographies into Darul Islam, a place of Muslim political sovereignty, Darul Harb, place of non-Muslim rule, or Darul Sulh, place of conciliation, that these categories are connected to a pre-modern Muslim imperial political context. And when that political context is no longer there, the coherence and the integrity of these categories also dissipates. And that argument basically is at the heart of the kind of rebuke that someone like Javed Ahmed Ghamidi gets from the ulama circles and class. That they see this basically as a modernist or even a secularist surrender to the distinction of the modern state. So both of these parties, what they're trying to do, interestingly, is they're trying to negotiate a heritage of a pre-modern Muslim legal tradition on the question of Muslim non-Muslim relations in a completely transformed political condition marked by the absence of Muslim political sovereignty and marked by the juggernaut of the modern state. And some have a certain kind of recipe of how to wrestle with that kind of absence of Muslim political sovereignty. Others have a different kind of recipe. But both of them, interestingly, are engaged in a similar problem. And yeah, that is Javed Ahmed Ghamidi's main argument. And his critics, of course, their main argument, other than the fact that he had served as an advisor to a military dictator, Pervez Musharraf, in the 2000 and first decade of 2000s. In addition to that, I mean, they basically see him as a modernist figure who is completely uh, uh, um, showing no regard for the sacrality of pre-modern Islamic legal categories. That if you begin to unravel the integrity of any of these categories, the whole edifice of the pre-modern Muslim legal canon would crumble. So yes, precisely, this is exactly what is at stake here. How do we translate and articulate um, the desires, categories, um, and concepts of a pre-modern Islamic legal tradition, which assumes the political context of Muslim political sovereignty in a completely transformed contemporary moment.
Right. Well, Professor, again, thank you for the brilliant conversation. Before we close, I'd just like to mention that we've just been scratching the surface, as it were, of these various debates. And for the meat of the argument and for the narrative of these debates, of course, listeners can refer to your book, Perilous Intimacies: Debating Hindu-Muslim Friendship After Empire, available via Permanent Black Publishers in India.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah, and I want to thank as well Permanent Black for making this book available in local currency in India, because that is, of course, one of my major audiences. So thank you to Permanent Black as well.
Right.
But thank you for your questions and for these excellent, trajectories of inquiry that really helped me reflect on my own book in more interesting ways. So thank you for your time and for these
Well,
excellent questions.
thank you, Professor.